Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Monticello's live stream, Getting Noticed on the Lewis and Clark Trail. We are so glad that you tuned in today. I'm Ann Lucas, Senior Historian at the Robert H. Smith International Center for Jefferson Studies at Monticello, and I'm here in the Jefferson Library, the heart of scholarship for the center and for Monticello. It's my pleasure to introduce you to my dear friend, the renowned Lewis and Clark scholar Clay Jenkinson, who's joining us today from North Dakota. Clay grew up on the western plains of that state and eventually found his way to Oxford University, where he was a Rhodes Scholar. He is the recipient of the National Humanities Medal, the highest honor conferred on a public humanities scholar in the US. And Clay is one of the creators of the modern Chautauqua movement and is known for his first-person portrayals of Thomas Jefferson, Theodore Roosevelt, and Meriwether Lewis, among others. He's appeared in 3 Ken Burns documentary films and made 4 documentaries of his own, and somehow he finds time, amidst all of this, to host the nationally syndicated radio show, The Thomas Jefferson Hour. And he's written 9 books, including the critically acclaimed The Character of Meriwether Lewis. And Clay, I want to congratulate you on your recent and timely re-release of Repairing Jefferson's America, a guide to civility and enlightened citizenship. But most importantly, for our purposes today, when we seek to place ourselves on the Lewis and Clark Trail, it is Clay's voice that guides us. So Clay, I wish you were here with me today at Monticello, but this is surely the next best thing. Thank you so much for being here with us.
I'm honored and delighted, Ann. We're old friends. We've been talking now for many years about our mutual friend, Thomas Jefferson and Lewis and Clark, and of course, you and many others in the Monticello world came on our famous tour of Idaho and Montana. I wish I were at Monticello. There's no place in America quite like it. You know, of all the historical homes, as you know better than anyone, it's the one that evokes the personality and soul of its designer best. But here I am at the heart of the Lewis and Clark Trail in Bismarck, North Dakota, on the Missouri River. I'm 1 mile from the Missouri and 43 miles from Fort Mandan, which is where they wintered between October 26th, 1804 and April 7th, 1805. In fact, they spent 219 days in what's now North Dakota, and that's the longest period they ever spent in any single state. So I'm at the next best place, let's say.
You are. So I know what you jokingly said, we have a big topic and a little space of time to cover it. So I thought we'd just jump right in. And I want to start, since we're at Monticello, let's start with Jefferson. So tell us about Thomas Jefferson's instructions to Meriwether Lewis. What were his expectations for how Lewis and the Corps of Discovery would document their findings?
It's a great question and a great place to start. So this was Jefferson's pet project, and Lewis was Jefferson's protege, one of many, as you know. But he had a special affection for Lewis. You know, Jefferson knew Lewis's parents. Lucy Marks supplied food for Monticello. Jefferson collected young, promising men that he could help along in their lives, and Lewis was one of them. He became Jefferson's private correspondence secretary in the White House in April of 1801. He spent almost 3 years with Jefferson, and imagine that as a preparation for the great journey that he undertook. So on the 20th of June, 1803, Jefferson issued his instructions to Lewis. And it's one of the great documents of the Enlightenment, not just of this expedition or of the Jefferson administration, but of the Enlightenment at large. And really, and as you know, it's a set of instructions that no single human being could possibly have fulfilled. He told Lewis to treat with native peoples and to assure them that we weren't there to buy their land, but there was a new great father, and their future relations in a diplomatic way must be with the United States and not with Britain or Spain or France. He asked them to take down Native American vocabularies whenever they had leisure. He wanted the latitude and longitude of every important landmark on the trail. He wanted to determine whether there was an all-water connection between the Atlantic and the Pacific. This is sort of the age-old dream of a Northwest Passage. He wanted Lewis to determine where trading forts, where trade factories might be set up so that we could bring native peoples into the American orbit and provide them things that they could not produce for themselves, like kettles and needles and awls and so on. It was huge. He wanted plants, he wanted animals, he wanted mineral samples. He told Lewis to observe the soil quality for possible future settlement of the United States. But if you come down to try to digest it into a single sentence, what he wanted was Lewis to conduct, sort of a grand Enlightenment survey of this undiscovered part of North America, the American West. And he told him, make sure you keep very full and accurate records. And in moments of leisure, if you have any, copy your journals in case there's an accident or something goes wrong, so that the data, for Jefferson, the data was the thing. We need that information, and you must copy whatever you can and make sure that they're put in separate canisters and so on, so that your information will get back should something go wrong. And he even said, if you have difficulties with native peoples, and you might, turn back. Don't get yourself into some sort of a struggle, because the data that you contain is more valuable than completing the voyage from the Atlantic to the Pacific. So I guess to conclude, and what's interesting is that there were other expeditions going on at the same time. Zebulon Pike was searching for the source of the Mississippi. And the next year he went to the source of the Arkansas. Freeman and Custis were doing their work down in Texas. Dunbar was surveying the Washita River in Arkansas. So there were a series of these reconnaissance trips occurring at the same time, but there's one and only one that got Jefferson's special attention, and that was the Lewis and Clark expedition.
So how and when were the journals of the expedition written? Are there certain participants who were charged with documenting certain types of information, or is Lewis doing this solo? Sort of sketch out the players and the process.
It's a long and complicated question. I'll try to give a really brief answer. So Jefferson expected Lewis to keep a journal. Lewis unilaterally chose William Clark to be his companion. Jefferson did not authorize that. He accepted it, but it wasn't his idea. And I think he wanted a single command. Lewis understood that this was a bigger challenge than he himself could fulfill. So he then chose an old Army friend, William Clark, under whom he had served for a time, and Clark became an indispensable part of the expedition. So both of them kept journals. Each of the sergeants, and there eventually were 4, were required to keep journals. And then some of the privates and others kept journals, even though they were not expected to. So some have been lost. Fraser's journal has been lost. We have no Nathaniel Pryor journal. But we do have journals from Patrick Gass, who was a sergeant, from Ordway, who was a sergeant, from Charles Floyd, who was briefly a sergeant. He's the only person who died on the expedition. And we have the journal of Private Joseph Whitehouse, and the journals of Clark, and the journal of Lewis. So altogether, we have 13 full, stout volumes of expedition journals, and no single day of the 28 months has no journal entry whatsoever. But here's what's so interesting. Lewis proved to be a very unreliable journal keeper. I have theories of that, but for the moment, I can tell you that out of the 28 months, Lewis's journals are missing for 441 days, over half. Clark kept a journal every day except 9. He was on a winter blizzard hunting trip in North Dakota, but he summarized those 9 days on the 10th, so there's no single day that Clark doesn't account for. And Sergeant John Ordway of New Hampshire is the most reliable of all the journal keepers. He never missed a single day. So we have these 13 volumes that Gary Moulton edited for the University of Nebraska Press with help from the National Endowment for the Humanities. And it's a treasury of information. But the person who is the most problematic from the point of view of journal keeping is President Jefferson's protege himself, Meriwether Lewis. And just why Lewis failed to keep a daily journal is an interesting question. But I can say this much. At some early point, he and Clark decided that if one of the two of them were keeping a journal, that sort of counted. It was sort of a captain's log, and Clark then takes the place. He's the reliable go-to default journal keeper. When Clark is missing for some reason, goes off on a hunting trip or whatever, Lewis then picks up the captain's log. So I think they figured out a system.
So I have heard you describe a grid that you're creating that sort of helps you map the journals and the various journal keepers and what gets noticed. So tell me a little bit more about your work in the journals and how you're tracking all those things.
Yes, thank you. So you know how much Jefferson loved grids, the famous vegetable grid from Washington, D.C. and so on. He would have just felt that he was in paradise if he had had an Excel chart system in front of him. He was enamored of grids and tables and queries and so on. And Notes on the State of Virginia emerged from a set of queries that were put to him by the Secretary of the French Legation at Philadelphia. So what I'm trying to do, Anne, is to figure out what gets noticed in the journals and what doesn't get noticed, and by whom and under what circumstances. So here's the most interesting thing I can say in this whole conversation we're having. Lewis and Clark didn't know that you and I would be talking today. They didn't know that we would be fascinated by every single aspect of the expedition. We want to know more about Sacagawea. What did she look like? Or did she have moods? Did she ever learn any English? Was she a good mother, etc.? We want to know about every person, the personalities, the songs they sang. Were there factions? Were there cliques? Was there religious expression that never gets written up in the journals? Were there fights? Did people pair off in any way? Were there people who were shirkers of duty? Were there people who were always cheerful and reliable? At no point did Lewis or Clark or anyone else step back and say, let me describe an average day in the expedition, how the camp was set up, where the latrines were, how the cooking messes worked, who sang during the fiddle music that often accompanied the expedition late at night. Nobody bothered to do that because they didn't know that we would be this fascinated by it. We would give anything for that data. And so what we do, as you know, Anne, is we go to the 13 volumes of Gary Moulton's journals and we comb them. We try to pull out things that are revealing and that help us to create a linear narrative. So if you think of someone like Stephen Ambrose, his book Undaunted Courage shown here, he went through all of this and he gathers up these fragments that happen to get mentioned for one reason or another, and he puts them into a linear narrative. But Lewis and Clark never did, and of course Lewis never wrote his book. And so we're stuck grabbing these fragments, and we sometimes perhaps make more of them than we should. So let me just read you one quick paragraph from James Rhonda, who is the greatest living Lewis and Clark scholar. And by the way, he gave that fabulous keynote talk at Monticello in January of 2003 on the West Portico, in which he said that the Lewis and Clark expedition was America's first great road story, which I think is fabulous. But here's what he said in one of his essays. What we know about the lives of those who ventured up the Missouri makes for very thin reading. There are just hints and scraps about men like John Thompson, Moses Reed, and Silas Goodrich. They have their moments in time, and then, for the most part, they are lost to us. Because we know so little, we fall back on conventional stereotypes. Here is Drullier, the hunter, Gass, the carpenter, Shields, the blacksmith, and Shannon, the forever lost. But none of these cardboard cutouts satisfies, and we long to know these men as flesh and blood. I think that's one of the most important things ever written about Lewis and Clark. So we have to be careful not to normalize our impressions and to assume that we know. And as I'm sure you know, archaeologists say if they could be airlifted for one day into ancient Athens, or to the siege at Troy, or to Mycenae in the Peloponnese, we would know more about the Achaean Greeks than we can possibly know from all of the shreds of documents and artifacts that exist for us. And so the same is true of Lewis and Clark. Everyone that I meet wants to know, what was Sacagawea like? What did she look like? We don't know, because they didn't know that you and I would be having this conversation. So I'm creating this big Excel chart, and I'm trying to decide the following question: what gets written up and what doesn't? And so I'm just sort of holding this ruler here. This is the radar line. And so here's how you get noticed. I have a sort of a taxonomy in the Jeffersonian fashion. You get noticed if you feed the expedition when it's hungry. You get noticed if you screw up or mouth off to the captains. You get noticed if you get hurt or injured. You get noticed if you get lost, as young George Shannon did a number of times. You get noticed if you're the dog. Seaman the dog gets noticed a lot because he's sort of the pet. You get noticed if you're Sacagawea, especially when she did things that were really important for the success of the expedition. You get noticed when you shoot the captain, as poor Pierre Cruzat did on August 11th, 1806. And so think about that. Certain things rise above the radar and get written up. These are people in a hurry. These are official government documents. They don't have a lot of time to write dear diaries. What's below the radar really fascinates me. What's going on that we never hear about? They say that in an expedition like this, after 48 hours, the inner personality of every single person. Who are the whiners and who are the cheerful ones, and so on. So what I'm trying to do, and others are working on this too, say David Nicandri, is go below the radar and try to tease out hints from the journals, both of what they say and what they don't say, that would help us to understand the journey in a fuller way. So this grid will be all of the 28 months of the expedition, day by day, with each of the journal keepers and what they wrote and who gets noticed and for what reason. Just one quick example. Last night I was reading the journals from after they split up. They came back in June of 1806. They split up at basically Missoula, Montana, and Clark went one way and Lewis went the other way. Clark in the next 10 days writes about who killed what animals, who killed the deer, who killed birds, who killed elk. Normally he just says 3 hunters went out. Sometimes they don't even mention the food supply. But why does he do it on this occasion? Because they've just, as you were, in the Bitterroot Mountains, where they nearly starved or certainly had nutritional difficulties. So now when they get down on the plains of Montana, he's obsessed with the food supply. 2 weeks later, when they get into buffalo country in central Montana, he stops talking about who killed what because it no longer is a critical issue. So you see the point. You get noticed when you do something remarkable, either remarkably good or remarkably bad, but you don't get noticed. And there are people on the roster, I just made a list this morning, who almost never get noticed because they never did anything special.
That was my question. Like who got dropped out altogether from the narrative? So let's hear.
That's it. So, in any situation like this, there are people who are wonderfully reliable and good-tempered and do their job, but they don't do anything that gets special attention. So here are a few. Richard Windsor, you almost never hear about him. Peter Weiser, Hugh Hall, Silas Goodrich, Thomas Howard. There are about 12. And they only get mentioned when they're mustering, when they're leaving St. Louis, when they're leaving Fort Mandan, when they're splitting up. And once in a while, someone gets a hangnail or falls off a horse or something, and then they get noticed. But for the most part, we know almost nothing about these people. And yet, if you actually could get airlifted into the expedition, you might say, wow, Hugh Hall is a terrific guy. He's always reliable, but he gets sort of shouldered off the journal stage by John Coulter and George Drouillard and John Shields and the Field brothers, because they're the ones, A, that Lewis and Clark like most, and B, they're the ones that do the things that you have to notice on any given day.
So is Hugh Hall's obituary say that he was a part of the core discovery? I mean, that's the other question I have is later in life, do they get noticed? Are they, no?
No, today they would all have book contracts and be in miniseries and, you know how it would be today. But then they didn't. They just disappeared back into their lives. So we know a few things about them. And there's a wonderful scholar named Larry Morris, who is LDS and a great researcher. And he spent a lot of time in the records in Salt Lake, tracking down people like James Thompson or Thomas Howard, names that are so common that there are hundreds of descendants. And we don't know which track is right and which track is spurious. And he's really determined what can be known about what happened to them. Most of them simply went back to lives. They got double pay and they got land grants. Some of them traded those land grants and some of them took them up. A few went into the fur trade. A number of them died violently in Blackfeet country up in Montana. But for the most part, we just don't know. What we do know comes from Larry Morris's book, The Fate of the Corps, which is, it's not glamorous. It's not the kind of book that you love to read, but it's an indispensable contribution to the bicentennial, which existed from 2003 to 2009, because he did that. That's what scholarship is, doing that extremely, sometimes tedious spade work that eventually produces important scholarship. And so every future Lewis and Clark scholar has to read The Fate of the Corps.
Well, when you and I've had this conversation, but I want you to share it with folks. The Fate of York, I think, is such a telling episode. Can you tell us a little bit more about what happens, who York is, and what happens to York at the end of the expedition?
as you know, Monticello is doing such important proactive work on race. It's really leading the national conversation about this. So York was an African-American enslaved man, roughly the same age as Clark. He was given to Clark as a boy, which was not at all uncommon, as his personal servant or valet. They were friends in some sense of the term. And when Clark came on the expedition, he just, without even thinking about it, brought York along to shave him and to lay out his clothes and to do other things that a slave would do. And York turned out to be a pretty interesting character on the expedition, partly because he was exotic. Most Native Americans had not seen an African American before. And so they were sort of astonished. And in their world, what was unusual, his skin color, and he was a huge man apparently, struck them as spiritually significant. So the term is often used as medicine. They thought that he had big medicine because he was so different from anything that they had ever seen before. And the captain sort of played along with this up to a point. There's a famous incident in North Dakota where a Hidatsa skeptic, a man named Laborn, the One Eye, actually spit on his fingers and tried to wipe off what he assumed was war paint from York. So York performs an important duty. He carries a gun, he hunts, he's off alone at certain times. He helped Clark survive a flash flood. When they get back, York feels that he has earned either emancipation or special treatment because of all that he had done on the expedition to make it a success. At that point, Clark sort of reverted to the worst sort of Southern slaveholder character and got extremely angry that York was being uppity. And he beat him severely. He threatened to sell him into the Deep South. It's not a pretty picture. Before the bicentennial, we didn't know much about Clark after the expedition. Thanks to several great biographies, we know a lot more about him, and we're a little more critical of him now because of this and because of his dispossession of Native Americans. But York eventually was either freed or given a certain amount of freedom. His wife was back in Louisville and Clarksville. He had been taken by Clark to St. Louis. There are all sorts of rumors and legends about this, but some people, including Washington Irving, believe that he was freed, but he regretted it and asked Clark to take him back under his supervision. We just don't know, Anne. And of course, so much of this gets clouded with what I would call racially charged mythologies and with racial stereotyping that it would be very hard to prove from the actual journals. This much we do know. However, there was an incident early on when they're in Iowa, I think, maybe it's Missouri. One of the white privates threw sand in York's face, and Clark thought that York might actually go blind over this. So what was the cause of this? We don't know, but one can conjecture that this white private felt that York was getting beyond the boundaries of what an African American was allowed to do. On the other hand, it could have simply been a dispute between two men on a difficult expedition. We don't know a lot, but York is an important figure. In the 1950s, he was sort of regarded as kind of a minstrel figure, which was a wholly racist way of seeing him. More recently, he's been regarded as a kind of African American freedom fighter, which I think is also something of an imposition. But he is an important player. And if you made a list of the people that you have to reckon with on the expedition, you don't have to reckon with Hugh Hall, but you must reckon with York. And by the way, one name, Jupiter, York, this is what white people did. They gave names often from Greek and Roman mythology. There's a kind of a smarmy literary cruelty to some of that. So we don't know York's full name. All we know is that he had a single name, unlike John Coulter or William Clark.
So I'm getting lots of good questions,
Good.
but I have a couple that I want to end with on my part, and then we'll start looking at questions that we're getting from our viewers. Tell me what you hope to find as a result of your study, of your grid. What's your goal?
My goal is to. I know this sounds like a postmodernist view, but it's not how I mean it. I hope to complicate the story. The story has been oversimplified. it's more complex than we think. So Stephen Ambrose, whom I greatly admire, said that Lewis was a manic depressive. We don't know that. And as you know, it's always a mistake to try to diagnose someone who's not with us with a disease that wasn't known in that time. Jefferson said of Lewis that he had sensible depressions of spirit, and a hypochondriac, so that he was mentally unstable in some way or subject to moods. I would like to learn more about that, Lewis's silences. I have a section on that in my book, The Character of Meriwether Lewis, on Lewis and silence. I want to write more about that, and I think his silences are understandable. Also, the two captains write as captains might, but Joseph Whitehouse, who's way down the list, almost never gets consulted by historians, writes as a private, and he often has little descriptors or little moments of phraseology where he, in some sense, challenges the mainline view or adds a detail that really makes it more rich and interesting. And so I'm trying to bring nuance and complication back. And I'm also really interested in the silences. Why are there silences? Not just Lewis not keeping his journal, but some things they're not going to write about. It's not dignified enough for a government report on a reconnaissance mission of the Enlightenment. So those are a number of the things that I want to try to find out. And I want to see who gets noticed when, and see if this grid that I have of feeding me, getting hurt, screwing up, etc., if this holds up. So how many references are there to John Coulter? And do I think that those references are representative, or is it just because something unusual happened that day? So I'm hoping that it's a richer, more nuanced, more complicated, more, in some ways, more problematic story, because for so many years, it's been seen in a triumphalist way, these sort of heroic Boy Scouts crossing the continent. James Rhonda brought in Native Americans in his fabulous 1984 book, Lewis and Clark Among the Indians. That's never been fully absorbed into the Lewis and Clark scholarship. And I want to tease out what we can learn from oral tradition and from hints in the journals of these men. Remember, these are white men who are reporting Native American customs through a pretty strong Eurocentric Virginia gentry lens. And so we need to kind of remember with Humboldt, they had to put in a corrective lens. We need a little corrective lens on some of that to see what else we can learn.
What I love in hearing you talk about the complicated nature and wanting to complicate the story is it reminds me so much of the work we do at Monticello. In restoring the second and third floors of the house, for example, you're adding to this narrative where 50 years ago it was Jefferson alone by himself in his cabinet doing his work. And in the same way that you're looking at a private reporting on something that Lewis or Clark might write one way about, we do that at Monticello when we listen to the voices of Jefferson's family, to the enslaved, to the oral traditions. And so it does create this rich narrative where you can find so many different perspectives, and it fills out that whole story. And in bringing us back to Monticello, just in my description of this, let me ask you this. What do the journals tell us about Jefferson? What does your work tell us about, was he happy? Tell us, for those of us who don't know this cold, tell us what happened, were the journals published the way they were meant to be? Sort of round out that story.
Yeah, it's another complicated story, but let me be as brief as I can. So they come back. Lewis holds up the mail in St. Louis and sends his first report to Jefferson. Then he makes his way to Charlottesville and to Washington, D.C. We know that they actually got down on their hands and knees in the president's office, which I think is the state dining room now, and looked at maps and other artifacts. And then Jefferson said, in his usual way, go away and write your 3-volume report. And when that's done, we'll talk further. And Jefferson simply assumed that Lewis would have no trouble writing this Enlightenment report. Remember, when Captain Cook comes back, it's a team of people in Britain who do this: botanists and mineralogists and oceanographers and cartographers and ghostwriters. Lewis was trying to do this without really a full enough American intellectual infrastructure to do it, and he got in over his head. But Jefferson wasn't going to really respond until he saw the written report. And a key insight about this is that for Jefferson, the trip was only the prelude. It was the books, it was the data that was the real Lewis and Clark expedition. And so I think he was disappointed. Lewis never wrote the books. He died on October 11th, 1809, probably of suicide. That's certainly what Jefferson and Clark felt. And at the time he died, he hadn't written a single page that we know of his 3-volume account. And so it's tragic, Anne, because Lewis was a brilliant man. He was a genius of a certain sort. And Jefferson said in his famous biographical sketch of Lewis that you could trust anything that he wrote as if you had seen it yourself. He was that good, that objective, that discerning. When he died, thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of impressions, memories, descriptions died with him. And Clark had to pick up the threads of this broken project. And Clark was a really extraordinary man, but he was not a gifted writer. The only journal keeper that we wish we had more from is Meriwether Lewis. When the switch is on, when Lewis is writing, he's far and away the most extraordinary writer of anybody in the expedition. So Jefferson was disappointed, and he was also disappointed with Clark. He never really bonded with Clark in the same way that he did with Clark's older brother, George Rogers Clark. And as late as 1816, Jefferson is writing to William Clark saying, yeah, your map is pretty good, but it doesn't have latitude and longitude. You need to correct that because it's not really a proper Enlightenment document until those data points are added. And Clark's view was Lewis was in charge of latitude and longitude, and frankly, he bungled it. What do you expect me to do, Mr. Jefferson? Go back to Montana? It was impossible for Clark to supply that data. But for Jefferson, it wasn't really a good map if the latitude and longitudinal grid was not filled in at the source of the Missouri, at the Great Falls, at the confluence of the Missouri and the Yellowstone. So I think the overall impression I have is that Jefferson was a little disappointed, and particularly disappointed with Lewis, but he also loved Lewis like a son, and he was careful not to condemn him. But I think we lost a great deal there. I'll just say this much more. I know we're out of time. I do think Lewis wrote his book in a certain sense. That's one of my theories. If you look at some of the most famous passages from the journals, first seeing the Rocky Mountains, finding the source of the Missouri River, a birthday meditation on August 18th, 1805, or leaving Fort Mandan on April 7th, 1805, these clearly weren't Dear Diary. These were written later in a full sort of Enlightenment prose. Lewis was a literary figure as well as an explorer, and we have mistakenly thought that those diary entries are written under the campfire late at night, probably just a few jottings from which then he wove this narrative. And when he writes those famous passages, there are about 30 of them, I think that is the book, and that we have mistaken this as a diary when the book was going to be as if a journal. And these are heavily influenced by Scottish nature poetry and by other Enlightenment exploration and by Jefferson. So that's one of the things I hope to flesh out. Is I think the book is, or a fragmentary draft of the book is embedded in what we call the journals of Lewis and Clark.
Well, a question from George kind of points to this. He says, do we know Lewis didn't keep as full a journal, or were they apparently lost? So do we have a sense that any were lost, or?
Maybe a few things. There was a boat accident, and they put things in cache pits. There were 4 cache pits where they would kind of create an underground silo, and they got wet and things were spoiled. And so probably some things were lost. I asked George, I love to do this, read my book. There's a chapter in it about this, and I try to make sense of this. So for example, from the time they left St. Charles until they got to Mandan, North Dakota, Lewis barely keeps a journal. Why? Because it's not discovery country. Others had been that far. They had named the rivers. They had written accounts. They had mapped. So Lewis doesn't write then. But on April 7th, 1805, when they're leaving what Lewis thinks is the last outpost of the civilized world into terra incognita, he picks up his journal and he writes continuously for a long, long time. Flash forward to when he gets shot in the buttocks on the return trip near Williston, North Dakota on August 11th, 1806. That day, he says, he describes a pin cherry with full botanical nomenclature. And then he says, I think I'll just stop here. I'm not going to write anymore because I was shot in the buttocks. And so we know that from that point, August 11th until September 23rd, he's not writing because he's in pain. So if you look at the 441 days that are missing and track them, you can actually find a rationale for when he's writing and when he's not. But I would say this, it's almost certain that he wrote more than we have.
Okay, Norm asks, to what degree, if any, was Jefferson's thinking about the Lewis and Clark expedition influenced by von Humboldt's scientific travels in South and Central America?
That's a great question. You know, there's this famous incident when Jefferson meets von Humboldt in Washington, D.C. It's one of my favorite stories. There's no time to go into it in detail, but Humboldt writes to Jefferson saying, I'm on my way back to Berlin. I've been in Mexico for 5 years. I can't leave the Western Hemisphere without meeting the greatest figure of the Enlightenment. Would you mind, sir, if I came to pay homage to you and got you to sign my copy of your illustrious book, Notes on the State of Virginia? So Jefferson writes back this sort of timid letter saying, sure, come ahead. I'm not really worthy of all your praise. And Washington, D.C., by the way, has no amenities of any sort. But come ahead if you want. And so von Humboldt does, and they meet. I think Jefferson regarded, now that's an explorer. And you know, von Humboldt went back to Berlin and published 20 volumes of his explorations of Central and South America, including elaborate illustrations that he produced. Jefferson saw, like, that's what he wished Lewis had been. It's a little unfair, Anne. I mean, Lewis is a genius of a certain sort. Jefferson admitted he was not regularly educated. He sent him on this great mission with a full Enlightenment list of desiderata. Lewis did his best. Humboldt had advantages as a European, from the European educational tradition, and as an aristocrat that Lewis never had. And so I think Jefferson felt the biggest mistake I think Jefferson ever made was thinking everyone in his circle was a little Jefferson who had the same capacities. They could write on anytime they wanted. They never had moods, that they were data keepers. And Lewis just didn't happen to be that guy.
Well, we have a question from Cynthia about whether it was Jefferson's natural curiosity or was it his sense of needing to prove something, the refutation of Buffon about North America. What do you think drove him more when it came to the expedition?
Jefferson is cagey. He tells different things to different people, as you know. So when he was writing to the French and the Spanish and the British ambassadors, he said, this is purely literary. This is just an intellectual exercise. Please don't be offended. We have no commercial or geopolitical interests here. It's purely literary. When he writes to Congress, he says it's purely commercial. This is about extending the fur trade. It's about American commerce, because under the interstate commerce provision of the Constitution, he could justify that. So he says different things to different people. I don't think it has anything to do with his famous quarrel with the Comte de Buffon about the moose and American flora and fauna, although that degeneracy quarrel is one of my favorite Jefferson stories. He's just purely curious. Jefferson is the Joseph Banks of American life. He wants to be the impresario of these missions, of these great exploration missions. So he's sort of, if you think of John Kennedy in his famous speeches in 1961, he also does want to edge out the British and the French and the Spanish and the Russians from the fur trade. He wants the Western Hemisphere to be ours and nobody else's. And so he has a geopolitical interest in this. And he also, he really believed, you know, he's very complicated on Native Americans, but he really believed that we had a lot to provide them. Metal, the alphabet, Montesquieu's theories of government, and a lot to learn from them too. But I think he thought that the way to civilize Indians is to present an Enlightenment menu to them. Once they have a kettle made out of iron in their hands, they will want what white civilization will produce, and they will voluntarily begin to assimilate, not the sort of way that Andrew Jackson might have done it.
So George's question is, can you speak to Lewis's summary of the expedition members to Congress, where he essentially qualified individual efforts?
Yeah, so that's a great question too. There's a great 2-volume account of this, and in which all the letters that are related to the expedition are compiled by Donald Jackson, one of the greatest of all Lewis and Clark scholars. And in 1807, Lewis writes his final report, and he praises Drullier as indispensable and John Shields as a blacksmith without whom they would not have succeeded. And the Field brothers were always not only equal to any challenge, but better than that. And John Coulter was great. And then there are a few, he goes through everyone. There are a few that he says, a man of no particular merit. He was okay. I wouldn't make too much of him. But if you think about this, these are raw frontier recruits from Kentucky and Pennsylvania and Ohio country and Virginia. They were remarkably talented. And what's almost a miracle is they had no adequate job description, no vetting process except do you or do you not have the right stuff? And yet they got a carpenter in Patrick Gass. They got a terrific blacksmith in John Shields. They got a skin dresser, like a moccasin maker in Joseph Whitehouse. All the skill sets that they needed. Drouillard was such a great hunter. He was part Shawnee and part French that Lewis said, if Drouillard is healthy and there is game anywhere in the region, we are going to be well fed. And so they got the skill sets they needed without actually trying, or at least overtly trying to do that. But there were some people that were just, water carriers or boat paddlers, the kind of people you would find in any expedition of this sort. And Lewis is not afraid to say, not a person of no particular merit, including Charbonneau, whom Clark liked, the husband of Sacagawea, but Lewis found Charbonneau to be a kind of a coward buffoon figure.
All right, here's a good one. Peggy asks, are there oral memories or histories of the expedition from descendants of the Hidatsa, Arikara, or Mandan peoples?
Yes. So I live in their country, the three affiliated tribes they're now called at the Fort Berthold Indian Reservation, the celebrated Mandan, Jefferson's favorite Native Americans. And he met one, the big white, Sheheke, who came to Washington, D.C. with Lewis on the return journey. So we have oral traditions. And that's another interesting question about the old history and the new, Anne, because until around 1980, Native American oral tradition was just discounted. As you know, African American oral traditions were discounted, including the Hemmings children. Since then, we've gotten more intelligent about this. And so now we actually prize these oral traditions. And they turn out to be, on the whole, interesting and accurate and revealing and reliable. They used to be dismissed as these are just oral stories. Now we know that there's a tenacity in the way oral traditions are told. And there is there's a capital T truth that may not be verifiable in the historical record, but still has a truth capacity. And so, yes, the Hidatsa, I'll just give you one example, believe that Sacagawea, formerly known as Sacagawea, but Sacagawea, was actually born a Hidatsa woman. She went out to the Shoshone world and then came back. No white historian believes that. We think that she was a Shoshone child captured by the Hidatsa and acculturated into the Hidatsa world. But the Hidatsa are certain that she was born in their culture. So these complicate the story in some really interesting ways. And of course, she is one of the most sought after beings in American history, along with Pocahontas. She's actually buried in 3 different places. A number of states claim her. Some say she lived to be 100. Others say she died at the age of 25. I don't know. She's regarded by some as the guide of the Lewis and Clark expedition. That's certainly not true. And more recently, she's been sort of demoted into just a really interesting and plucky individual on the expedition. I don't think that quite does justice to her either. So these oral traditions count, and they were first really looked at by James Rhonda in Lewis and Clark Among the Indians. And now we're trying to get the Mandan to write Lewis and Clark Among the Mandan, the Lakota, Lewis and Clark Among the Lakota, the Shoshone, Lewis and Clark Among the Shoshone, the Clatsop, and so on. We need those things to be captured. And even if they're not 100% scientifically reliable, they're still fascinating and important windows on how those Native people see this great adventure.
All right, we have 1 minute, and it's such a simple question.
Good.
For 1 minute. What was the national reaction to, or maybe the legacy of, the expedition in the decades after they returned? Was it in the American consciousness? And if not, when did that change? And that's from Eric.
That's a great question, too. So the answer is that the expedition sort of petered out and disappeared. When they got back to St. Louis on September 23rd, 1806, people were saying, hey, everyone thought you were dead or that you disappeared. Huh, you're still alive, are you? But they said this, and they said, but Jefferson still thinks you're alive. He still believes you're coming back. And then they made their way to Washington. They were treated as sort of heroes. They got a really good compensation package from Congress, thanks to Jefferson. There were balls and celebrations and parades. And Lewis maybe got a little too far into some of that celebration because he should have been writing his book. But then because the book didn't come out, Lewis died, no book. A ghostwriter is hired by the name of Nicholas Biddle. A narrative account comes out in 1814. And then the story just kind of disappears. And no one really thinks about Lewis and Clark for decades. And it wasn't until the centennial in 1904 5 and 6 that things really heated up. And the original journals were first discovered then in Philadelphia and St. Louis, not the paraphrase by Biddle. And in the bicentennial, they became the most famous exploration story in American history. But for almost a century, they were essentially forgotten.
Well, Clay, I know I speak for everyone watching when I say that we're so lucky to have you to guide us, to bring us along the trail, to illuminate these stories of people who've been forgotten or who are under the radar. We could listen to you for hours, and I'm so grateful that you're willing to take this short window to give us your expertise. So thanks.
I've been looking at a mile a minute. I'm so sorry that we're rushed, but you have been on the Lewis and Clark Trail with me. Everyone who's watching this should consider coming. It's we climb this Wendover hike and we canoe on the White Cliffs area of the Missouri, and we go across the Bitterroot Mountains. And as you know, it's just absolutely fabulous. And there's nothing like being in the actual footsteps of Lewis and Clark and camping in the actual camps. And so I love doing that. I loved having you and the folks from Monticello and others on the journey last year, and we hope to do it again. But this, as you can tell, this story is almost infinite in range. And guess who's at the center of it? The third president of the United States, Thomas Jefferson.
Well, there's the perfect closure. Always the professional, Clay. Thank you so much. And everyone watching, I'll just say that we'd love to have you come back next week. James Madison is our topic for next week's live streams. And thanks again for all that everyone does to support Monticello and for paying attention on this afternoon. Thanks again, Clay.
Oh, my delight.